Well, thank you everyone for coming for a special event. Thank you for coming for a special event. We're welcoming someone home, Professor Nicole Rader, who was a Ph.D. student here back in the day, just a few years ago. But she has really emerged as one of the leaders in the field of criminology and criminal justice. She's a professor at Mississippi State University. She's also an associate dean, so she's been both the worlds of academic and administration. Good luck with that. And she has, as I mentioned, she had a PhD from SIU Carbondale, and hopefully at the end she will regale us with some of her stories here. She actually told me the restaurant where she wrote much of her PhD dissertation, and we'll save that for the Q&A. But she has done just tremendous work, and it just a couple years ago came out with a book called Teaching Fear: How We Learn to Fear Crime and Why It Matters. It came up with some really interesting observations and analysis about this realm. So she will talk about her book and broader subjects. Then we'll have a Q&A, which might include, as I say, her discussion of her time here. I also noted when I looked at her CV that she's taught a number of interesting classes, including Harry Potter and society. So we will save that for the end to hear about Harry Potter. So Nicole, please join us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's so great to be back at SIU Carbondale. I started at SIU in 2001. I finished in 2005. In the middle of that time, I gained a lot of friends. I had some amazing professors. I also got married and had a baby. So it was a very time-intensive 4 years. Today I'm going to be talking about my book that I am so proud of, which is called, like you said, Teaching Fear: How We Learn to Fear Crime and Why It Matters. I will start by going through the overarching research questions that I use for this book. I am a qualitative researcher by training, and so we all know that you start with the good research questions, right? Research questions are the very first thing you need to think about. So before I started this book project, I was thinking about these 4 questions. Where does fear of crime come from? How is fear of crime learned? How is fear of crime learning? How is that process gendered? And then how is it taught through families? So when we're looking at the approaches to teaching fear, unlike a book that you might see with a dissertation where the data is only from a dissertation project, I actually had data, as we're going to talk about in a second, from multiple projects that I used to help shape this book. And then previous literature, of course, but I kind of borrowed from some disciplines that were a little outside of what I was used to. And then I looked also at media and public opinion sources. So specifically, I had 101 qualitative in-depth interviews, which were over 4 different projects. So I can get into the specifics about this in the Q&A if you'd like, but at this point I will just say that these 4 studies examine perceptions of safety among married or divorced women and men. And then more recently, I've had the pleasure of learning to interview children, which is something that is just fantastic. I would highly recommend it. The goal of highlighting these projects in the book, which were quite different, was to understand the impact of socialization on the lived experiences of these participants. As I said, I also looked at my previous literature, as we all should, but I not only considered the literature from sociology and criminology, but I also looked at things in family studies, gender studies, psychology, and I even learned some things from computer scientists. In terms of the other kind of nodes of my book, I looked at general, like the general social survey, the Gallup polls, these public opinion polls that tell us about attitudes and behaviors that Americans have. I also looked at publicly available reports like crime reports, national education reports, and campus crime reports. And then I also looked at media sources, so information that was given specifically to women and parents, and so those are the 2 groups that we're going to talk about here, regarding safety and regarding crime. Okay, so before we can jump in to understand fear of crime, we really need to understand the reality of crime. We probably have some criminologists in the room or people who have been trained to understand crime patterns, but it's important to note that while Americans consistently pull high on the belief that crime is worse now than ever before, the reality of crime is quite different. And so on the left, we see the rate of 1,000 persons aged 12 and over. And the bottom is from 1993 to 2003, so from the left to the right. And so you can clearly see that while most Americans think that crime is a very serious concern, and that it has gotten worse over time, the demographic or the statistics just don't tend to show that. Because this becomes important for my story in a little bit, I also wanted to show some statistics about women victims by race and ethnicity, and this is just for 2023. And I know it's kind of small for some of you. So on the left side, we have race and ethnicity, so white, black, Hispanic, and other. And then on the bottom, again, we have rate per 1,000 persons, ages 12 and over. And the purple are the lines that show us, here's white women, black women, Hispanic women, and other women. And they characterize other, this is the National Crime and Victimization Survey, and so they characterize other as Asian, Native, Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander. So what you should take away from this first is that while people fear crime happening to women, the data show a rate that is relatively low. In fact, about 22 out of 1,000 experience some form of victimization per year, which is a pretty low statistic. Further, as we will talk about later, white women are less likely to experience victimization than black or Latinx women. So that's also something that we need to remember as we move forward. Further, when we start looking at the relationship between the victim and the offender, that is also something that we need to make sure we understand the reality of crime regarding. So what we need to know is that this first chart here, you can see the blue is acquaintance, this is stranger, this is family, and this is a romantic partner. And so you can see that most victims are murdered by an acquaintance followed by these three pieces of the pie, right? So stranger is right here, this piece, and that's all. Okay, and then also finally with this other chart, when we're looking at men and women, women are the blue line and the other line that is orange are men. And the bottom says acquaintance, stranger, romantic partner, and family. And so what I want you to take away from this also is that when we're thinking about strangers, women are least likely to be hurt by strangers than any other category of offender. In conclusion of this section, the recap on likelihood of victimization. Violent victimization is rare. Violent victimization has been declining since the 1990s. And when women are victimized, they are likely to be hurt by a known attacker rather than a stranger. Now that we have a sense of the reality of crime, we now need to turn to fear of crime. So here's what we know about fear of crime. First, nearly 30% of all Americans are afraid of crime, regardless of the year. This trend has not changed since 1970. So while we see we see declines in the reality of crime, fear of crime has stayed relatively stable. Women are more afraid of crime than statistics would warrant in most cases, and men are less afraid of crime than statistics would warrant in most cases. It always shocks my undergraduate students when I tell them that black men are the most likely victim and the most likely offender. They tend to have this image of women, or white women in particular, that may be the victim of crime. Further, when we think about parents fear crime happening to their children, especially at the hands of strangers, right? So they're not worried about, well, it's not like they're not worried, but they're worried, I'm sure. But they're most worried about a stranger kidnapping a child in a public space, like the cover of my book, which is at a park. That's why I have that as my cover. So fear of crime rarely matches up with crime rates. Okay, so then going back to our research questions, the first research question was, where does fear of crime come from? And we know now that it is not from the likelihood of victimization. We know that it is something else is going on. So the primary way that I talk about where fear of crime comes from in my book is based on crime myths. So crime myths, there are 3 that I lay out in my book. There are others. I know that there are others, but these were the 3 that I focused on that kind of guided my book. The first was that people are hurt by strangers. So that's the idea of stranger danger, which we're all familiar with, right? Like I said, you can think of a child being nabbed in the park. You could also think about a woman being assaulted at night in a public space late at night, like late at night. So those images come to mind. The second myth that I talked about is the idea that white women are most likely to be a victim of crime. We've kind of debunked that myth already, but I will also tell you that there is something called the missing white woman syndrome in the media. And so what that basically shows is that white women are portrayed in a more vulnerable and they also, a more vulnerable way, they also get more screen time from the media than victims of color. And so we think that that is happening in part because of this kind of, on the pedestal that we see with white victims, white women victims. Third, I'm not going to talk about this part today because I just don't have time with all the other things I want to get to, but I also talked about something regarding potential victims. And so I wrote, potential victims are the key to preventing their own victimization. So what I mean by that is that most people believe that with self-protection or precautionary measures that they can prevent their own victimization. And this is a myth because it assumes that prevention of stranger danger is what you need to know. You don't need to know how to prevent your spouse from abusing you or something like that. You're more thinking about not being assaulted at night. And then also it places unfair burden on potential victims, so people who have not been victims, instead of potential offenders or society at large. So I kind of unpack that a little bit more in my book. Okay, so back to fear of crime and how we learn it. So fear of crime is learned through socialization, which is not really a big surprise to most people in this room. Crime myths are transmitted through social actors. So that can be through parents, schools, and the media. Those are the 3 that I focus on most in my book. And when we look at how these crime myths are, how they're learned, first, crime myths are taught to others verbally and observationally. Second, they are reinforced by socialization agents. And then finally, they're imitated by those being socialized. And I'm going to give you some examples, so if you're not with me, just hold tight. So in other words, fear of crime is taught through the socialization agents, and that is what I think is going on with fear of crime and perception of risk not matching up. But it kind of goes beyond that. So it's easy to say, like, we're socialized to think these things, we believe these things, we imitate them. But for something to really be crystallized in society, it has to be something that everyone knows. It has to be something that's so commonplace that no one questions it any longer. And so crime myths have that effect. They become the fabric of society and something that everyone knows to be true. And the way that this happens is through what other fear of crime researchers and myself have talked about as the intergenerational transmission of fear of crime. So fear of crime and crime myths are passed from generation to generation, as I'm going to show you in a second. So I did want to tell you that I'm not going to talk about my third research question today. If you want to know anything about gender and fear of crime, I published a lot of articles on it, so I'm happy to talk about that as well, but for time, I'm not going to be able to get to everything. I am going to focus today, for the rest of my talk, on how fear of crime is taught through families. This is especially important because, for me, my data didn't mean to do this, but it ended up lending itself to a generational case study. So I primarily interview Gen X parents who primarily have Gen Z children. And so it gave me a sense, I'm gonna talk about what that is in a second, but it gave me a sense of a case study that I could kind of see how the intergenerational transmission of fear is passed down from families, in families. So in case you're not like a generational person and you don't know that much about what this is, if you grew up between 1946 and 1964, you are a baby boomer. If you grew up between 1965 and 1980, you're considered Gen X, which is the group of parents I'm going to be talking about today. If you grew up from 1981 to 1996, you are a millennial. If you grew up from 97 to 2012, you are considered Gen Z, which are the children I'm going to talk about today. And then if you grew up 2010 to today, then you are Gen Alpha. At least that's what they're calling it now, but who knows? So again, these are the two generations that I'm going to be talking about, Gen X and Gen Z. So I have some images here that if you grew up as a Gen Xer might ring true to you. The first is over to the left. It says latchkey children. So in case you were not born in this generation, a latchkey child is someone who returns home after school to an empty house because their parents are working. Okay, so that phrase that kind of got coined during the Gen X time frame. In terms of safety, there are three things that I have up here. The first is what we call the, quote, white kidnapper ban, right? So the white kidnapper ban is going to get you. If you grew up in this generation, you may have heard that phrase. I see some of you smiling, so I know that you know what I'm saying. If you didn't grow up in this generation, one thing that might surprise you a lot is that we put missing children on milk cartons for a while there, which was kind of an interesting idea. Like on the one hand, you get to see missing children, but on the other hand, you're a child at a school drinking milk, looking at missing children, right? So I don't know, I have mixed feelings about this, but you probably know about that. And then finally, the last image is of McGruff the crime dog, and he takes a bite out of crime. That was his slogan. He is actually still around today, but his most watched media campaigns were during the Gen Xer time frame. Now, if you grew up as a Gen Z person, there are a few things here that I wanted to note. The first is that the left-hand side, you see a helicopter, and then you see some bubble wrap. That's what we see down there. So if you grew up between 97 and 2012, you may have been told that your parents are helicopter parents, and you may also have been told that we need to bubble wrap you. So some people call Gen Z the bubble wrap generation, which may or may not be fair, but that's the label. In terms of Gen Z safety lessons, there are two primary areas that we see come through that were not there before Gen Z. The first involves school shooting prevention campaigns. So the two images here, one is the National Education Association. It says protect our schools. People are marching because they are hoping to end school violence. And then the bottom picture are actually youth from the Parkland High School shooting who protested gun violence and took a very social action approach to that. The other thing that Gen Zers really had to learn about a lot growing up would be online crime prevention. I have a daughter who every year she has to go through online crime prevention modules at school. It's just a commonplace part of learning in today's school system. And growing up in the 80s, you wouldn't have had that. So the idea of online crime prevention is, again, something that we don't always think about, but it is something that is different for Gen Z and beyond. This includes digital predators and then also cyberbullying. So those are two big campaigns that we see regarding safety during this time. So what we see that ends up happening here is that Gen X parents, and I'm going to give you some examples soon, but Gen X parents have to merge their childhood safety messages, things like stranger danger and kidnapping fears, with the new fears that come to their Gen Z children, like online crime and school shootings. And so by merging these two things together, they become the safety values that guide Gen Xers' parenting practices and how they think about crime and victimization. Now we get to the fun part where I get to read quotes, which is my favorite part of being a qualitative researcher, if I do say so myself. So because I have this data from these 4 different studies with Gen X parents who have Gen Z children, I was able to tease apart what their core safety values were. And then I'm also able to look at how that ties back into some of these generational differences. So the first one that my participants have talked about over the years is that, quote, good parents over-supervise their children, which I'll talk about in a minute. The second value is that the world is a scarier place than it used to be. And then finally, there's this new age boogeyman. So I'm going to go through all of these things. All right, so if you are a Gen Xer parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about right now. And if you're not, then you probably don't. So the idea with Gen X parents is that they face extreme societal pressure to helicopter their children and to bubble wrap them more than in previous generations. So this latchkey generation idea contributes to Gen X parents perhaps not wanting to do the same thing to their own children. So rather than having this hands-off approach to parenting, they take an over-supervised approach to parenting. This can be called, some have called in the literature, paranoid parenting. So you're going to see some examples of this, but the idea is that when parents are talking to their children about anything, they try to keep them as close as possible to them. They also try to, I don't know how many of you are teaching college these days, but parents will call and ask questions about their students, and if they can get grade, whatever, they ask things, and that wasn't something we saw before that generation. So it's not always about safety. Sometimes it's about other things, but we do see parents from Gen X playing a much more hands-on approach to their children's lives than we saw when they were growing up. So discussing Generation Z, Karen Malone, who studies research, or she does research in Australia, she explains this best, saying, with the outside world presented as a dark, dangerous, and high-risk place, childhood for many Generation Z children is increasingly becoming an indoor activity. Children are being chauffeured around their neighborhoods, often for very short distances because of the increased fear of traffic and stranger danger. This is despite evidence that Australian suburbs are more safe for children than they were 3 decades ago. And so again, the same thing for American families and thinking about like the idea that we don't let kids go outside, we don't let kids play, this idea of like over supervision, highly restricted activities of children. So here are 2 examples. Okay, first, Barbara, I want to point out that she's telling me that she's not really that worried, okay? So that's the first thing you should note. And here's what she has to say. Yes, but I'm not extremely worried. I mean, it's not like worrying about safety takes a lot of my energy, but I see to it that they call. They often walk alone to school, and then I see to it that they call me when they are at school. It makes sense that you want to hear that they have arrived there. Yeah, they leave home, and then they call me when they arrive at school, and then they call me when they get home as well. So basically, well, this is not something that she's really worrying about all that much. Her child has to spend a significant amount of time checking in with her all day, right? And then Sandra also talks about this. She says, I keep her inside, or if she goes outside, I will go with her. I tell her there are boundaries, and I only let her stay in the backyard if she wants to play outside. She can't go in the front yard. She can't go past my car. She has to stay in the small area where I can see her. And when pressed, Sandra talked about safety as a primary concern. So Sandra is worried that someone is going to kidnap, take her child, and she is not going to have her child any longer. So her solution to that is to restrict her child's behavior as much as she possibly can. Safety value number 2, the world is a scarier place than it used to be. So as I mentioned earlier, it is clear that victimization rates, homicide rates, have been declining since the 1990s. Mind you, many of these Gen X parents were in high school during the 90s, right? So they were actually in high school when our crime rates were the highest they had been in 4 decades. But they still think that their time when they were children was better and safer than it is for their children today, which shows you the power of the media and the power of intergenerational transmission of fear. So they had several ideas about this. They thought that people were nicer when they were children, there was less crime, the world was safer, and it was a simpler time. So those are the 4 different ways that they discussed this. So here is an example by Brandy, and this may ring true to Gen X parents. So she says, we played outside as kids and we were gone for hours each day. We would be gone 8 hours and come home for dinner, and my family wouldn't think anything about it. My children will not do that. They will stay where I can see them at all times, even if that means I have to sit outside and watch them. I am afraid that someone is going to abduct them or hurt them, you know? So again, this idea of like everything was better back in the day. And then Alice also talks about this. She said, when I was growing up, both as a child and as a young person, there was so much more freedom than there is today. This is something that has changed dramatically, I think, between my growing up and my kids growing up. We were always allowed to go on our own everywhere. We were never taken by parents to practices or friends' houses or anything like that. So again, it was a simpler time, which adds to parental fear of crime for their children, because they feel like their children are going to be hurt in a way that they wouldn't have experienced when they were children themselves. Okay, then finally, the third safety value is that there is a new age boogeyman. So the new age boogeyman takes 2 forms, and I'm gonna go through both of them. But in this case, we can think about the online predator. So think about Dateline. Think about Sally, who is the 13-year-old friend who is actually really a 40-year-old sexual predator. So the idea that we cannot control who someone is online is extremely stressful to Gen X parents. This is fueled in a very interesting way, I learned this from computer scientists, by something called reverse socialization. So in this situation, kids actually know more about the online environment than their parents, which makes the internet an even more dangerous place to Gen X parents. So they know more than their children about this, about the internet, and they can work it, they can change it, they can mold it, and parents really have no idea how to interact in that space. Okay, so Carla talks about this. She says, probably, just because times have changed, like when we were kids, you just roam free, and that doesn't happen. I don't even think you play in the front yard by yourself nowadays. So probably I would be afraid for children, or like you always hear about online people, predators. I always wonder how people with kids are dealing with this, Your kid is going to be on the computer, so like, how do you deal with those kinds of situations? So I think that's a very obvious one that many can relate to as well. The other type of new age boogeyman are school shooters. And so this is something that you may never have thought about. I read an article that talked about this and I was just like, it just changed my opinion about everything. So Gen X parents were in school before school shootings were a public social problem, but their children have never known school without school shootings. So it's a really interesting way to think about it. When I think about growing up and doing drills, I'm thinking about tornadoes. I'm thinking about, I don't know, whatever else. But I'm sure not thinking about school shootings. My children go through school shooter drills every year. They don't even think it's a really big deal anymore, I think. And that's just something that, like, as a parent, it's really hard to contend with that, right? It's just really hard to know how to make sense of that. And so this provides a gap for parents of Gen X children, Gen X parents with Gen Z children. They have to provide safety advice and lessons to children, but it's really hard because of that gap. And this is further complicated, as we always like to talk about the media, by the media who sensationalize and try to explain school shootings in ways that don't really track with the reality of crime. And so, like, perception is reality there, right? So it doesn't matter what's actually happening, it just matters what people see when they turn on the news. Okay, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but I did wanna just let you know that I also talk to kids about what they hear their parents say. And so I have a chapter called What Kids Hear in my book, and I have a chapter called What Kids Fear in my book. And I haven't said this yet, I don't think, but I really try to make this book accessible, because I didn't want it to just be an academic book. I wanted it to be a book that parents could read, that schools could read, that people that worked in the media could read, and they could get some advice or some information about how to do things differently. So the first thing that I will say with our Gen Z kids that I've interviewed, here's what they hear kids saying. Here's what they hear their parents saying. So they hear them say first that strangers will try to trick you. Second, that you should fear people outside rather than inside the home. Third, that your mom and dad know best. And fourth, that not all fears are valid. So here we go with strangers are tricky. So Lisa, one of my favorite children of all time I interviewed, loved her. This is what she had to say. So she said, yeah, so when I bike to and from school alone, my parents have told me that I shouldn't talk to strangers. Like, for example, if someone says, come here, I've got some candy, maybe you want some. I'm supposed to bike past them. And the same if someone says to me, hey, I've got a puppy at home, maybe you'd like to come see it and have it. I'm not supposed to go home with a stranger. So we can see the idea of stranger danger and Gen X parenting playing a very key role in this, in what kids are hearing. So in my book, I talk about, it's really not great grammatically, but it works for the book, the teach fear better lesson, okay? So first, what I tell parents is that the unintended lesson that kids are hearing from them is that all strangers are bad. The teach fear better lesson is that there are good and bad strangers, so let's teach kids how to find the differences. So for example, who should your child find in an emergency and why? And so one thing I found, I did some interviews in Sweden, and it's random, that's another story, but the people in Sweden talk about strangers as good and bad. They do not just talk about all strangers as bad. And so what that does is it gives children the opportunity to think about, what is it about this person that makes me feel bad, instead of just thinking like all strangers are bad. Because if kids are in an emergency situation, they're gonna have to find a stranger. And that stranger, they need to know who you think they can trust and who you don't think they can trust. So that's one example that I talk about in my book. Okay, what kids hear? Fear people outside the home. So here is what Caroline had to say. She said, we lock our doors and stuff whenever I'm at home or they're out on a walk that I didn't have to go on, which is funny, she didn't want to go on the walk, right? I keep the door locked and don't answer it for anyone unless it is a friend that I know is safe, or it is them because they didn't bring their keys since I was at home. It's the stuff they tell me. Keep the door locked. Don't answer it unless I know who it is at the door, and even if it is an adult and I know who it is, just say that my mom and dad aren't home, so come back later or something like that, okay? So the unintended lesson here is that you should only worry about strangers and you shouldn't worry about people you do know, right? The idea of like, make sure you lock the doors when I leave, make sure, things like that. It unintentionally tells children that they should only worry about things outside the home. So the teach fear better lesson is let's avoid emphasizing stranger danger prevention techniques. So for example, a lot of research has shown that teaching children to trust their own instincts when they feel uncomfortable, even with a family member, is a really good strategy. I always find it interesting when I give these talks over my many years of studying this topic, that it is much harder for people to feel okay about talking to their kids about known people than it is about strangers. So it's, for whatever reason, parents, they're okay talking to their kids about a rando guy jumping out of the bushes and kidnapping them. But they're not okay talking about, if you do not feel comfortable with a family member, here are the steps that you should take. And so knowing that kids are hurt more by people they know than people they don't know, that strategy doesn't always work out as well as parents intended. Again, most of these things parents don't even realize that this is how kids are interpreting what they're saying, right? Okay, the third lesson, and then especially in the South where I live, mom and dad and teachers know best. And so Holly talks about this. She says, listen to your so I always ask the kids that I interview, I actually ask everyone this question. I always say, like, if you had to give advice to other people in that situation, what advice would you give them? And so Holly's answering a question about what advice she would give to other kids about how to stay safe from crime. So she says, listen to your teachers and parents, because if I had to do that, give other kids advice, I would tell them to be safe. Listen to your teachers and only listen to your teachers. Don't listen to anybody else because you don't know what they want. You always know that your teacher will keep you safe or your mom and dad will keep you safe. Don't listen to anyone else. Okay, so that's the advice that she's very serious about it. So the unintended lesson here, while well-intentioned by parents, is that parents know better than children, even when it comes to children's emotions. The teach fear better lesson is let's communicate openly with kids about why they feel like they do about certain people. So I always use this example. I think it really helps solidify what I'm saying. So you all, if you have children, you've been at a party and your child is being what you perceive as rude to someone at that party, right? We've all been in that situation. And as a parent, you're embarrassed, right? You're like, why are you being so rude to my friend? Like, why are you doing this? But think about it like this. There's some reason that child feels uncomfortable with that person. And so, of course, you can't have a conversation about that in the moment, but maybe that becomes a teachable moment after the fact for you to say, what about this person made you feel uncomfortable? What was going on in your head? And just letting them have those conversations, research has shown, again, makes them trust their instincts and makes them feel comfortable if something does happen to them going to someone else or even their parents. And finally, what kids hear, number 4, not all fears are valid. So this is from Lisa, again, one of my favorite, she has so many great quotes. So most of the time, my mom knows what I think is scary, but otherwise, when there's something scary, I usually tell her. But sometimes when I think it might sound too ridiculous, or there may be too many explanations, then I don't tell my mother because I think it would be silly. So what we see with this is something you probably don't think about either through a child's eyes here. Children, for the unintended lesson, children do not have the capacity to determine if their fear is valid. The teach better lesson, let's have open discussions with children about why they are afraid of things, even if those things are invalid or you deem them as invalid. So for example, rather than telling kids to go back to sleep if they think a monster is under their bed, again, you're really tired right then, so I get it, but like the next day maybe have a conversation about why they're afraid. What is it about that monster under the bed that makes them feel so worried? That's a silly thing for a kid, but it also might mean that if something serious is happening to them, they will feel confident that you've had conversations in the past and they're more likely to come to people, or they're more likely to come to you when something is going on. The first thing I want to note for conclusions is the more theoretical part of this, right? Like the more academic part. And here's what we know. What we know and what I've talked about in my book is that fear of crime is based on crime myths that emphasize fear of strangers, and especially for white women. We know that those crime myths are going to become safety lessons, things that are passed down from generation to generation. Next, safety lessons become the basis for our values about safety, how we really think and feel deep down about these topics. And then finally, safety values are generationally unique and become the basis for the intergenerational transmission of fear of crime. So that's the more academic part. When we look specifically at Gen X parents, the safety values that they have are providing building blocks for teaching safety to Gen Z children. Gen Xers' own safety values influence how they teach their children, fear of kidnapping, fear of strangers, that merges with core safety values that they have about Gen Z in particular. And this leads to teaching fear with the following values. Good parents over-supervise their children, the world's a scarier place, and there is a new age boogeyman to contest with. However, while parents have good intentions, they don't always understand what kids are taking from those safety lessons and how that is being interpreted by children as they get older. So Gen Z kids hear these well-intentioned lessons, but they don't always provide helpful knowledge to kids about how to reduce fear and to reduce victimization. So instead, I argue in teaching fear that having a well-informed and open discussion with children that teaches children to both trust their instincts and feel comfortable talking to parents if something does happen is a better way to go about this process. So with that, I will open the floor for questions, I guess. Thank you.
So, yes. So we know that the gap in the fear of crime and actual risk of victimization comes from data on robberies and muggings and homicide and violent crimes, assaults. So I'm wondering for cybercrime and bullying. There isn't official statistics on that. So what is the gap in terms of prevalence of victimization in online settings versus fear? Is that a smaller gap?
So I have done some research with others on that. Be louder. I have done some research. Okay, I'm coming back to the mic. I mean, I think I'm super loud. I guess I'm not. Okay, I guess I'm not as loud as I think. All right. So the question was about cybercrime and if the reality of cybercrime and fear of cybercrime match up or don't match up, like we see with the statistics I showed earlier. So the research is a bit mixed, like you said, because we don't necessarily have enough data on these types of things. But we do see that fear of crime rates for, sorry, I'm like trying to, sorry. Okay, I gotta come back a little bit. When we look at fear of crime rates for cybercrime, we do see similar types of patterns, especially with parents being fearful for their children. What we don't necessarily understand, I think, and what I think is a real gap in the literature right now, are children's perspectives on that process. So the research that I've seen on cyber victimization talks about how children don't necessarily talk to parents about this anyway, and so they're navigating that space in a way that is very different from being bullied and someone throwing you into a locker, like our old school version of bullying. So I think we have a lot to learn at this point, and I don't think we have a lot of information yet that I could definitely say that there is the same connection.
Nicole, could you talk a little bit about the media? Has there been a discernible change in how crime is reported? Is there a...
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about the media and the role that it plays. So I spend a lot of time studying the media as well as families. And one thing that we know for sure is that the media overemphasize crime and victimization. So there is the saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so we know that the media, especially the news media, is really hyper-focused on selling stories, right? What we also know though is that isn't the primary source of socialization that most people have. So if you learn things from your parents, your school, and the media is likely the least important of those three. Those strong ties don't hold as well with the media as they do with other forms of socialization. So I don't know about how it has changed over time. I think that most research just talks about how it is portrayed, but they don't necessarily talk about, at least the research I'm aware of. I'm not aware of a study that looks at it over time and if it's gotten worse or better. I just think that we find the most important crime stories of the day, and we're going to sell that to consumers when we're looking at the media. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Are you familiar with the bear in the woods question? Would you rather be alone?
Yes.
Explain that.
Okay.
Do you want the answer that so many women seem to think that they are choosing a bear over a man alone?
Okay, so the question, actually, I'm laughing too because my editor for this book wanted me to write an op-ed that was called this, The Bear in the Woods. And so the op-ed that he wanted me to write was about this topic. So the bear in the woods, do you all know what that is? All right, so the idea is that women would rather choose a bear to fight in the woods than a man. And I don't know, I think it's like a social media thing as well. Like it's like people.
Just to be alone in the woods with a man or a bear.
Oh, to be alone in the woods with a man or a bear. Right, so many women select the bear. And so the question becomes, like, why would they do that? And that's exactly what I'm talking about in this talk, right? That's exactly what I do research on. So the idea is that we have been taught, I didn't talk about gender as much in this presentation, but women have been taught to fear men at such a high level, they fear all men. So some of the research I've done when I've talked to women and men will tell me that they're most afraid of like groups of other men, or going to a city or a place that is unknown to them, that causes them fear. But women will say that they're afraid of a stranger who is always a man in all places and under all circumstances and under all contexts. And so that shows that it's such a powerful socialization element to being a woman, that you grow up thinking that you could be injured or hurt by a man. And so, but it's almost always a stranger who is a man. It's not like, people you know. So yeah, that's how I would explain it. Exactly how I would explain it is like most women feel more confident in their ability to fight off a bear than to fight off a man, stranger in the woods. Yes. I don't know which way to go. Yeah. Whoever was first.
So I was just kind of thinking about desensitization, I think, among Gen Z, and especially people in my age range. We've experienced these school shooting drills so much.
Yeah.
We've experienced cybercrime so much. We watch shootings on TV constantly. We play violent videos.
Yeah.
We watch violent videos. That we're desensitized to any form of crime, and we make jokes out of it. So how do you think that desensitization among, I would say specifically Gen Z, has impacted the fear of crime?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about desensitizing crime and violence among Gen Z. I think that is a great focus of a project, and I think that someone should write a dissertation on that. I have not, like I said, I focus more on kids, like younger kids, but as these kids are now becoming, in college or whatever that age might be, it's interesting to think about. I'm not aware of anyone that has specifically looked at that, so I do think it would be a great project. There's something else I was going to say on that. Really, the fear of crime research and criminology in general is just not talking to younger people that are not incarcerated very often. So like my work is all about attitude, like how attitudes are framed, how people construct narratives to fit how they're living their life. And I think that we're missing conversations about attitudinal things with people from Gen Z. One other example that I have been like really thinking about now for a while, that came up in one of my interviews and then continued to come up, is about location sharing apps. So when I talk to parents about location sharing apps, they tell me that they would never want people to follow them. But then they'll say things like, but my kids follow me. My kids know where I'm at all times because they're on like Life 360. But Gen Z kids don't seem to care about people tracking them. Like it's not something that they think about in the same ways. And so I'm really interested in looking at those generational differences and why we might see some of those things going on. But the same kind of thing with what you're talking about. I think that's a really fascinating dissertation. So you should write it. Yeah.
So I'm Audrey Billy. I'm a senior here studying psychology. I'm going to graduate tonight. I'm currently in an effective correctional practices class and also only in public class now.
Okay.
So this kind of joins those subjects pretty nicely. But my question was, you were talking about more of the ideals of like stranger danger and fear of the outside world with Gen X parents. Well, I'm Gen Z. My parents are Gen X. And I'd say that they're a little bit different than most parents would be. But I was wondering if there are factors and differences in somebody who lives in a rural area versus urban or town areas. I had a lot more freedoms than my friends in town did, and I wonder if they could be from my parents, but also are there other factors that would have those effects?
Yeah, so what I find interesting is that I do qualitative research. So first of all, qualitative research is not generalizable to the entire population, right? We're not trying to make generalizations across entire groups of people. But in all the interviews I've ever done, they all say the exact same things. And this includes in Sweden. This includes in Sweden, in the southern United States, in the Midwestern United States. They may talk about how they do things differently, but the process they go through is always the same. And so I am sure, I grew up in St. Louis, and so it's a very different context than maybe living in Carbondale, I think. But while my mom was worried about me going out late at night, don't go to the city, right, which is the scarier thing, her process and her explanations for why were the exact same. So I think that we see the same process even if we don't see the same exact messaging, if that makes sense. But a good question. Okay, I'm gonna go here and then I'll come back. Go ahead. I'm just going down this row and then I'm gonna come back here.
As a millennial, someone who has served overseas and lives with PTSD from combat, who has been counseled and helps and counsels others who have dealt with this, we are often taught to not dehumanize the things that are in our mind. So don't use the terms that would be pejorative or make you go hole into a mountain, and don't go from insurgent to terrorist, and that becomes this big thing in your head. So would it be beneficial, do you think, for generational parents to not say the online stranger, the stranger in the van, but to humanize it as this is what a person would look like as a threat, and this is your practical applications of what's happening here. Don't make it a nightmare, make it an actual situation that could or could not happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And to me, I'm not a psychologist, so I think psychologists could really help with this in the sense that we could have psychologists who are doing more experimental designs. Like, I would be really curious to know if we change some experimental design, what outcome we might have, because I think that would provide parents with better tools to talk to children about stranger danger and safety. But like I said, it always blows my mind, and I say this as like someone who has studied this for so long, that we are totally fine talking to our kids about a stranger jumping out of the bushes, but we cannot, under any circumstances, figure out a way to talk about people they know, or like you're saying, like talking about the person as more likely, just a person, and this could happen, and what would you do? So I think having some scenarios would be great. I don't have experience on that, but I think that's a great point. Okay, back.
Age range of the children?
So I interview children who are considered middle age or middle childhood, so 9 to 12-year-olds. And then, yeah.
I have an example of fear of crime. I got my hair cut this morning on a busy street in Carbondale.
Okay.
A man with a grocery cart meandered by. He wasn't rushing, it was just the person who was cutting my hair grabbed her keys and went and locked the door. And I said, good grief, he just walked by.
Yeah.
And she said, if I unlock that door and he comes back, I'm going out the back door and you're dealing with it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Extreme fear. That's it. I don't know. I don't have any thoughts on that one. Sorry. In the back.
I'm interested in the different media that the one generation had and the generation X, is it X and Z? Because it seems to me that all the Z's I know don't read papers, they don't watch TV, they get all their news on social media.
Right.
Which I think is different than what their parents were getting.
Yeah. I think it's super fascinating. Yes, so I'm interviewing, we're calling it the Sorority Safety Project right now. So we're interviewing sorority women and we're talking to them about safety, fear of crime, victimization, things like that. And we found, so I have a graduate student who's doing the study who's like 24, let's say, I don't know, something like that. And I'm obviously not 24. And so one thing that's been really interesting to me is that I don't know, I actually am going to stop doing the interviews. Like, I've actually picked another 24-year-old that's gonna come in, a graduate student, and help with this project. Because what I have found is I don't know what follow-up questions to ask. Like, I don't know what they're talking about. This is what I've decided. And so I do think that I have no idea what's going on, okay? Like, I just don't. I'm going to be honest. So I think there is a knowledge base that Gen X parents and millennial they're also lacking. And I think that contributes a lot to how we're able to talk to children and others about the world, because I don't have a lot of social media. I have Facebook, but I haven't been on it since for 10 years, and I think it says I live in the wrong place. So, but I don't have any of the other things. So yeah. Go ahead.
So because you're blaming the media on how they report crime, it bleeds it.
Yeah.
And that's always the case. But it's also the case that that's what we want.
Right.
News
Reflects.
The news doesn't report nice, happy stories because no one watches it. And
Yeah.
It's been proven over the years. So I think instead of blaming the media, we need to blame ourselves, right? We want to hear these stories.
Yeah.
And that fear, 20 years ago, we only heard about the kidnapping that was in our area. We didn't hear about it all across the country. But we're the ones who caused the ratings for what the media report.
I think that's a very fair point. One thing that I've been reading about lately are podcasts, and I haven't been listening to them. I've just been reading academic articles about it, and what I have learned is that women are the most likely true crime podcast listeners. And to me, that's super fascinating, and I want to know more, right? So again, all these great research questions that I could see people doing dissertations on. Younger people than me, because I'm clearly not going to be okay.
In the 80s, in the late 80s, there was a movement to go into the schools and teach kids about bad touch, good touch, and secret touch. I have no idea if that kept going, or I'm wondering if you saw that mentality, or at least that awareness in some of the parents, and to alter that stranger danger.
Yeah, that's a great question. So none of the parents I've talked to have ever brought that up, which is interesting to me. But I have learned some looking at reports from the Department of Education, which are just super fascinating. Not so much about awareness of child abuse, but more on school shootings and kind of the protocol and procedures that schools now go through, and how that process came to be over time. And so that's something I could definitely look into and see. I don't have the information today, but I would imagine that I could go back and look at reports from the Department of Education, and we would see how those campaigns, it's kind of how I talk about them, as these safety campaigns, how they became part of schools. But parents do not talk about schools, except for to say that their kids might be in a school shooting. And the kids tend to think that it's BS. They don't seem to think that any of the things they learn at school are very helpful. I don't know what to do with that information, but they're honest, so that's kind of the best information I have there. Yeah.
Can you say more about the suggestion that parents help children distinguish, I guess, positive strangers from negative strangers?
Yeah. So I learned most of the things I talk about in the book from my Sweden study, where I interviewed mothers, fathers, and their children in Sweden. And it really struck me as interesting that they would talk about there are just some, they have different kind of phrasing, but there are some older men who sit in the park and there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. And so when my kids tell me they're worried about that, I tell them what are you worried about? What specifically are you concerned about? And so I have noticed that since I have started doing this kind of research, when I talk to my friends who are also Gen Xers with Gen Z children, that they have never really thought about it. They've never really thought about, they just think of strangers as bad, right? But so some of the examples I give in the book, maybe you could supervise your children. Again, this isn't my area, so I have to always be careful about what advice I'm giving people, but one example, if you were at a park and you were worried that something bad was going to happen, maybe instead of like don't send your child over to who you think are bad people, but maybe let them like explore a bit further. And so some of the things that we've seen with Gen Z is that their recreational activities are so restricted now. And so by giving children a little bit more leeway and reporting back on how they are handling situations, that's really what I mean with bad and good strangers. Yeah.
As a baby boomer parent of a Gen Z child, what came to my mind when you were talking about that was that I remember we told our daughter that, like, if we were at the mall and we got separated and she was lost, that she should try to find either somebody with a uniform on, like a police officer or security officer or somebody, or a mother who was nice to her children.
Yeah,
who was there with her children, and you could see her being nice.
That's actually the advice I give my children as well, or when they were younger. I would say find a mom. Like if you can find a mom. But yeah, that's always a little hard. But like find a mom. Yeah, don't buy. Oh, okay, that's fair. Yeah. And then also how policing has changed more recently is also an interesting question, right? Like obviously I'm talking primarily, well, not obviously, I'm talking primarily to white parents. And so actually I'm working on a study right now where I'm interviewing black parents, and I'm looking at what those differences might be. Again, surprisingly so far, after about 10-ish interviews, they say the same things. So I don't know, I'm gonna keep going. I'm sure there's something different, but I do think that, yeah, those messages are very important to give, but not always easy. It's like talking to your kids about things you don't want to talk about. And so that's something that I think parents need more tools for that. I don't think that parents have any tools or manual or guidebook most of the time on raising children, but having something that would talk about ways to deal with this would be I think it could be really valuable to communities. You were.
Looking at the other side, what would you advise to people who have been thought to be the aggressor? So, for example, I have two examples. Lately, I went to an airport, and there was this young boy. I encountered him for the first time.
Yeah.
And I said, but no communication. And then, when we were about to go back our bags, I saw him again and said, "Smile, hi." And then the third time, we were about to be seated, waiting for our call. I finally talked to him. "Hey, how are you?" And then the bomb said, "Stop.
Right. Yeah. But I think again, it's
Oh, what should I do?
Yeah.
I'm not a bad person, but and then lately, around 8 weeks ago, I was in Walmart, and there was this, pardon to say, old white lady said, "Go home to your home country."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, you could guess what country I come from." Because it's migrant crime.
Yeah, exactly.
We are being, demonized to be, hey, we are here in the country, taking your jobs, killing you. Right?
Yeah.
It hurts, right?
Yeah.
So what would you be advice for people?
I think my advice, I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to go societal on you here, but I'm going to say that we are focusing, the one myth I didn't really talk much about, we focus so much on teaching women how to not become a crime victim by like doing self-defense classes, carrying keys between your fingers, locking your doors, don't go places at night, don't go places alone, like the list goes on and on. But we spend no time as a society really helping men understand how to interact and navigate that kind of space. And so for me, that might mean that we're talking to men about how to, deal with some of the things you're talking about. But it also could mean like, these are the things that men do that are healthy relationships. Like that's something that I've seen some research on where when you're teaching boys about safety, instead of being like, don't, sexually assault people, that's ridiculous, right? But you can say like, you need to understand healthy relationships. You need to understand what that means for women. You need to understand what that means for men. And you just start like having those types of conversations. And some family studies research has shown that that can be also be effective. So I don't think it helps with what you're saying. I also think that racism, is a major societal problem. I think that, people who are in positions of privilege are also going to often get more hype and more awareness. So yeah, I'm sorry that happened to you. Did you?
I have a few, but okay. I'm going to start with the crime decline.
Okay.
So when you said the 90s, the first thing I thought about was the crime bill. What would you say is actually contributing to the decline in crime in America?
That's such a big question. Crime decline since the 1990s, what's contributing? So I think there are lots of things that we could look at, so many factors. And because I study victims, I don't know that I would really want to comment necessarily on all of the declines in crime, but we definitely know that the system, the way that, words, Nicole. Like 3 strikes and you're outlaws, prison reform, things like that have played a factor in that. But it also just seems like it's a less violent time. So I think there are lots of ways that it's been constructed. There are lots of things that have happened with the criminal justice system over time. But for me, I think that it doesn't actually matter what's happening if everyone thinks that everything is dangerous, right? But good question.
I'm also curious about how trauma shows up in this with the parents.
Yeah.
When you talked about the fact that none of the Gen X parents talked about touch, I was like,
yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Because,
yeah.
The statistics would demonstrate that they experienced that, so why are they not having those conversations with their kids?
Right.
Are you asking any questions, or do you have any comments about how something like ACEs might inform some of this conversation?
Yeah, so I have not used any kind of, ACEs is like the, yes. So I do not ask them specifically about their childhood trauma. And so unlike when I interview a lot of women about fear and victimization, and usually people will tell me if they've been victimized, like I hear those stories that way, but parents are normally focusing on what they're telling their children and not really focusing much on their own personal childhood experience with victimization. And again, maybe because they don't know me, they don't feel confident with that. But I think also they're trying to convince me that they're a good parent, right? So like that's what they're doing. Because like once I start asking questions, they're like, well, I do this. And I'm like, this isn't about you being a good or bad parent. This is about like how this process is changing your relationship and what we can do as a society to make things different. So yeah. Okay, woo, you guys had some good ones there. Okay.
Nicole, tell us about Harry Potter. Your Harry
Potter. Okay, yes. So I'm obsessed with Harry Potter on a whole different level. And so I have never taught an honors class, and I really wanted to teach an honors class. And I asked, the dean of the honors college is like a friend of mine. Like we go to spring break together. So I was like, hey, can I teach a class on Harry Potter? And he was like, sure. So what I ended up doing, I taught it like an introduction to sociology class. So if you teach intro to sociology, you have like every chapter is a different institution. And so I did that with Harry Potter. And there are actually books about Harry Potter and society. There are actually textbooks on this. But so like we talked about schools, and we talked about Hogwarts, and we talked about like putting people in houses and what that might mean in terms of, racial profiling. Like you can do so many different things, right? You can do so many things with a Harry Potter class. So it's just really fun. And what I love about that class, so I had 17 women. They were all women, and they were all honor students, and they were all going to be presidents someday. Like they're so amazing. And so because I have experience as a woman leader, and that's not always easy, especially being a young woman leader, I was able to kind of serve as a mentor to them, and I still have a relationship with them. So it was actually really, really awesome. One of my favorite classes I've ever taught. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? No. Okay, thank you. Oh.
Restaurant.
The restaurant. Oh, I went to Long Branch, and that's where I wrote my dissertation. So back when you could smoke in Long Branch, because I was a smoker when I was in grad school, like a very heavy smoker. I miss smoking. I haven't smoked in a long time, but I do miss it. So I haven't smoked since 2002. Actually, I quit smoking while I was here. So, But yeah. Okay. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.